Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 97, Dmitry Donskoy. Ivan II died in 1359, leaving his 9-year-old elder son, Dmitry, as heir. The young boy was fortunate to have a strong regent and protector in Metropolitan Aleksey, who effectively became the ruler of Moscow, along with being the head of the church. He is often considered to have used his position to make the church a political tool that did not always work for the benefit of the wider Orthodox community. Dmitry is another ruler who enjoys a popular reputation for greatness that historians are rather more circumspect about. During the 30 years of his rule, Moscow expanded its territory and strengthened the centralized authority of the knyaz, starting to actually become the dominant force in the east. Most famously, of course, he led his army to victory over the Mongols, which we will look at in the next episode. In 1988, he was finally canonized as a saint, as which he has the somewhat dubious privilege to be the patron of the military police of Russia. However, many historians see him as indecisive and inconsistent, and argue that Moscow's success in this period was mainly down to Metropolitan Aleksey. Aleksey certainly had plenty to do as regent during Dmitry's minority. Dmitry took the throne the same year that the murder of Khan Bertybeg triggered the anarchy in the Great Horde, and as Algirdas looked to take Lithuania ever deeper into Rus territory. Even within the northeastern Knyazhestva, there were political changes. While Dmitry's accession to Knyaz of Moscow was unopposed, when it came to the Grand Knyaz's title, he faced a new challenger, the Knyazhestvo of Suzdal-Nizhny Novgorod. You'll recall that the Horde had made Ivan Kalita share the Grand Knyaz's title with Alexander of Suzdal for a while. That Knyaz's younger brother, Constantine, had challenged Simeon the Proud's right to succeed his father as Grand Knyaz, but the Khan's approval of Ivan's will had settled that issue. In the 1340s, Constantine had conquered Nizhny Novgorod and had taken Gorodets on the Oka from Moscow, substantially expanding his Knyazhestvo and giving him control of a lucrative choke point on the Volga trade route. Janibek had approved the acquisition of these territories, which made Constantine strong enough to be a genuine rival to Moscow. When Ivan II died, the new Knyaz of Suzdal-Nizhny Novgorod, who was also called Dmitry, once again bid for the throne of the Grand Knyaz. Metropolitan Aleksey took this in his stride, quickly persuading the new Khan in Sarai, Murid, to recognize Dmitry of Moscow. However, leadership of the Great Horde was being contested by several rivals. There was no longer a single Khan. The Khan in Sarai was just that, the claimant who happened to be in Sarai at that time. There were other people in other places who also claimed to be Khan, and any of them could support or attack Moscow. With one Khan's approval secured, Alexei, not entirely unreasonably, thought that he could strengthen Dmitri's position by getting the other Khan within striking distance of Moscow, Abdullah, the puppet of a powerful commander named Mamai, who did not have the necessary lineage to claim the title for himself, to also approve Dmitry. Alexei's approach was successful, and Abdullah also granted a Yalik to young Dmitry, which Murid, equally reasonably, took to be undermining his authority. So Murid withdrew his Yalik and recognized Dmitry of Nizhny Novgorod as Grand Knyaz in 1362. However, unlike the situation a few decades ago, the chaos in the Horde meant that no contender for Grand Knyaz had reliable Mongol backing that they could call on to enforce their claims against each other. The competing Yaliks did not lead to Mongol armies riding into the northeastern Knyazhestva. By 1364, Dmitry of Moscow, or rather the Metropolitan acting for the 13-year-old Knyaz, gathered the armies of Moscow and its loyal client Knyazes and marched on Nizhny Novgorod. After considering the size of the forces brought against him, Dmitry of Nizhny Novgorod decided not to fight, and the title returned to Dmitry of Moscow. A full peace deal was signed 2 years later, when Dmitry of Nizhny Novgorod gave his daughter in marriage to Dmitry of Moscow, and effectively became a vassal of the Grand Knyaz. But that was not the end of Dmitry's challenges. Tver also had a young and energetic knyaz, Mikhail, who had ambitions to restore his knyazhestvo to its previous leading position. His main trump card was his brother-in-law, Algirdas, who was willing to provide Mikhail with diplomatic and military support in his own quest to become overlord of all Rus. This support had some drawbacks too. Mikhail needed to avoid looking like the agent of a foreign power. Algirdas was a pagan, and one reputed to be flirting with the Catholic Church at that, and there was always the risk that the Mongols could decide that they were not willing to tolerate a Lithuanian presence so close to their core territory. The trigger for the conflict was something unexpected. The town of Moscow had developed around a small fortification where the Niglinaya River meets the Moskva. Over time, the fortifications had been expanded, but had later been destroyed by the Mongols. Ivan Kalita had built a new fortress with oak palisades. Now, in 1367, Dmitry decided to replace those timber fortifications with new stone walls, running essentially where the brick walls of the modern Moscow Kremlin still stand. He demanded that the other knyazhestva supply the men and materials to build them. If a knyaz did not agree, the chronicles say Dmitry afflicted them. Mikhail of Tver was one of those afflicted, which led to him fleeing to Lithuania. Alexei reacted by putting pressure on the junior knyazes of Tver, which was divided into appanages at the time, in an attempt to displace Mikhail. However, he found that most of them remained loyal to Mikhail. So, on the authority of the Metropolitan, he instead demanded that Mikhail and his boyars come to Moscow. Mikhail had to comply or face excommunication, but when he arrived, instead of negotiations, he was thrown in prison. This interrupted the flow of tribute from Tver, so before too long pressure from the Mongols led to him being released. Mikhail returned home, but now it was open war. Moscow was first to move and invaded Tver in 1368. Mikhail called on Lithuania, which counterattacked with an army that assaulted Moscow. The city's new stone walls stood firm, but the attack was enough to force Moscow to accept a peace, with some territory conceded to Tver and an agreement that Dmitry would not interfere in its affairs. This agreement managed to hold for 2 years. In 1370, Dmitry, by now 21, so maybe playing a bigger role in the decision-making, even if Moscow's policies and actions remained consistent with what Aleksey had already been doing, saw that Lithuania was busy elsewhere and launched a new attack on Tver, quickly overrunning several towns. This time, Mikhail turned first to Mamai, who issued him with a Yarlik, making him the Grand Knyaz of Vladimir. Unfortunately, Mamai sent no men to back this proclamation up, and none of the other Rus chose to acknowledge this promotion. So, Mikhail once again turned to Lithuania for help. Algirdas was still willing to help. He brought another large army from Lithuania to join Mikhail, and they attacked Moscow together. Once again, Moscow's new stone walls defeated the attack. Mikhail did not give up. He went to Mamai again, and received a Yarlik as Grand Knyaz again, and again. Mamai did not give him men to go with the title. This time, Moscow countered with its own moves. Dmitry also went to Mamai and persuaded him, including by paying a nice sum, to issue a new Yarlik restoring Dmitry as Grand Knyaz. Meanwhile, Aleksey was busy negotiating a peace with Lithuania, to be sealed with a marriage between one of Dmitry's cousins and the daughter of Algirdas. Mikhail was thwarted once again. Mikhail spent the next 4 years continuing to try to take the throne. Border skirmishes were constant. He received yet another Yarlik from Mamai, still without any force to back it up. But he could not win support from the other Knyazhstva. Even the boyars of Novgorod remained loyal to Moscow. In 1375, after reaching agreement with Algirdas, Dmitry assembled a large army with contingents from all the knyazes and marched into Tver. Mikhail's army was crushed. He knew his struggle was hopeless and accepted a treaty acknowledging Dmitry of Moscow as his elder brother, relinquishing his claim to the title of Grand Knyaz and Knyaz of Novgorod, and his right to independent relations with Lithuania or the Horde. He now became a junior knyaz under Moscow. Seeing off the challenges from Nizhny Novgorod and Tver were clear victories for Moscow. They usually get chalked up to Dmitry simply for happening during his reign, but I think it's not too hard to see why the Metropolitan might deserve more credit, at least for Nizhny Novgorod, than the teenaged knyaz. Dmitry's successes went beyond seeing off these challenges to his right to be the Grand Knyaz. Rostov was also brought under Moscow's control, and Starodub was annexed. And if you recall our discussions of Ivan I, there was also the matter of the purchases mentioned in Dmitry's will: Galich, Uglich, Bieloozero, and Kostroma. To recap, Dmitry refers to these territories as being purchased by his grandfather, although there are no documents or references from Ivan's time mentioning this. The general consensus among historians is that these acquisitions were made by Dmitry, and that he wished to legitimize them by asserting that there was some kind of existing claim. Together with the suppression of Nizhny Novgorod and Tver, these acquisitions represented a considerable expansion of Moscow's territory and power, but even so, it remained smaller and weaker than the rapidly expanding Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This meant that in addition to the military and political challenges to Moscow that Alexei helped Dmitry tackle, the Metropolitan faced ecclesiastical problems, which he tackled with the same uncompromising decisiveness that his predecessor Feognast had. We'll take a more detailed look at the Russian Orthodox Church a bit later in the podcast, but it's worth briefly discussing one aspect now, and that's how the Orthodox Church saw relations between the Church and the state. Many listeners from Catholic or Protestant countries will be familiar with their own country's history with instances of the Pope claiming authority over kings and governments, as well as spiritual authority over the members of their church. In this podcast, we've mentioned several times the idea that the popes claimed the authority to recognize or not recognize kings, or to excommunicate kings who did not do what the Pope wanted. These claims developed over several centuries, eventually ending up with the doctrine of papal supremacy. These ideas reached their full flowering after the Great Schism, which is important because it meant that they were a Western rather than a universal Christian position. Rather than supremacy, the Orthodox Church pursued symphonia, Greek for accord, a concept dating back to Constantine that saw the church and state as complementary institutions working together without attempting to dominate each other. Its proponents claimed that the concept was based on the biblical relationship between Moses, leader of Israel, and his brother, the high priest Aaron. Within Byzantium, symphonia had a certain logic. The empire had existed for centuries, and people probably believed it would last forever. Emperors came and went, but the empire endured. When it lost territory in wars, that territory was lost to enemies of a different faith from outside the empire, and the church and state could wish for their recovery without running into any conceptual problems. The Greek metropolitans appointed to the Rus had brought symphonia with them, and for a while it had not raised any issues there either. However, now the metropolitans had tied themselves to the ruler of Moscow, who did not rule all the Orthodox believers of Rus. Dmitry did not directly rule the people of Mikhail of Tver, Rostov, or other kняжества. Many Orthodox Slavs lived under the rule of Algirdas, a pagan, or Kazimierz of Poland, a Catholic. These rulers could hardly sympathize with Alexei's vision of an Orthodox Church living in harmony with Grand Knyaz Dmitry. Alexei's background as a Muscovite boyar and his clear partisanship made it difficult for anyone outside of Moscow to deal with him. This was the conundrum that drove the ongoing attempts to create alternative metropolitanates for the Orthodox of the old Rus Knyazhestva. The Patriarch in Constantinople, who had the final word on these matters, had made the Church's position clear. He fully supported and identified with Alexei's defense of his interests as Metropolitan. We have surviving letters from Patriarch Philotheus to Dmitry stating, quote, "The Metropolitan appointed by me is an image of God and is my representative. So anyone who is submissive to him is actually submissive to God and to our humility." End quote. He instructed other knyazes that they must remain loyal to Moscow and the Metropolitan. Mikhail of Tver even found himself excommunicated when he took refuge in Lithuania. This was obviously a highly useful position for Dmitry, and equally obviously problematic for Algirdas and Kazimierz. But the Patriarch's position was based on pragmatism, not principle. He had supported Moscow because he believed that Moscow was the leading power of the Orthodox Slavs. He believed this partly because Theognost and Alexei were very good at telling him that this was the case, but also because the Church's accommodation with the Mongols made it sensible to back the knyaz that the Mongols also appeared to be backing. In the 1360s, as Poland conquered Galicia, Lithuania expanded further into Rus territory, made Lithuanian converts into knyazes, defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Blue River, and looked like they would be expanding all the way to the Black Sea. Philotheus began to be concerned that he had made an error, that Moscow was not the strongest, and that Mongol support might not be the decisive factor. When Kazimierz of Poland sent a new demand for a separate metropolitanate for Galicia, he included a message that, quote, "If the grace of God and your blessing are not bestowed upon that man, do not complain against us afterwards. We will be forced to baptize the Ruthenians into the faith of the Latins if there is no metropolitan in Ruthenia, for the land cannot remain without law." End quote. In 1371, Philotheus gave in and consecrated a metropolitanate for Galicia. The Lithuanians, of course, had already been trying to get their own metropolitan for a while. By the 1370s, Lithuania was already approaching being the largest kingdom in Eastern Europe, and Algirdas had become the most powerful ruler of the lands where Orthodox Slavs lived. And he had the largest population of Orthodox subjects. He complained to the Patriarch that Alexei did nothing for his Lithuanian flock, writing, quote, "The Metropolitan blesses the Muscovites to commit bloodshed. He never visits us. He never goes to Kiev. When someone kisses the cross to me and then goes to Moscow, the Metropolitan releases them from their allegiance." End quote. The Patriarch decided that it was not in the Church's interests for Moscow and Lithuania to be at war. He wrote to Alexei and Dmitry telling them to make peace with Mikhail of Tver and Algirdas, and reminded Alexei that he was the Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, not Moscow. He sent Cyprian, the head of the Bulgarian church, to Lithuania to negotiate with Algirdas. It's likely that these were the negotiations that led to the arrangement between Moscow and Lithuania, and to Algirdas withdrawing his support from Mikhail, resulting in the final settlement between him and Dmitry in 1375. Because Algirdas was not a Catholic, the threat to the Orthodox in his realm was division and enmity among the Orthodox believers, another split in the church, rather than them being forced to convert to Catholicism, as Kazimierz threatened to do with his Orthodox subjects. So, rather than create a separate Lithuanian metropolitanate, which could have increased the risk of a split, in 1375, the Patriarch appointed Cyprian as Metropolitan of Kiev, Rus, and Lithuania. He was to serve alongside Aleksey until his death, which was to come in 1378, and was then to succeed him in a united metropolitanate for all the Orthodox of the region. The hope was that, as a foreigner, Cyprian would be free of partisan loyalties and would avoid political bias, enabling him to serve the whole of his Orthodox flock fairly and to preserve the unity of the Church. However, as we shall see, the principle of symphonia will mean that Cyprian also ends up deciding that he has to favour one ruler, and he also chooses Moscow. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.